He was clueless.
Relentlessly pursued by the press outside court, the boss had a lot to smile about.
And the FBI was stunned by his cluelessness.
My father is the last of the Mohegans. They don't make men like him anymore, and they never will.
Every day he reigned as the boss was a day closer to the pen or a fitting demise 6 feet under.
A New York City jury is expected to begin deliberations today in the trial of John Gotti, the reputed boss of an organized crime family.
I really hope you don't think I'm talking about the Teflon Don John Gotti. John Gotti was a mob legend with an untouchable legacy. But his son, this man known as John Angelo Gotti Jr., was far from great and even farther from being half the man his father was. The truth was, deep down, Gotti Jr. was just like us. Or at the very least, he wanted a life like us, far away from crime. A feat that his father thought was impossible for a made man. The only way out of the mafia at the time was in a wooden casket. Go ask Leia Garofalo. Oh, wait, you can't, because she was made to disappear by her own husband, Carlo Cosco. So, if you are wondering what happened to John Gotti's son, if you want to know if he did the impossible and exited the mafia, if you want to know if Gotti Jr. is alive today and free, I'll tell you. But before I show you anything, you gotta follow me back to 1988. Reagan was on his last legs as U.S. president. The Iraq-Iran war was coming to an end, and both Gottis, father and son, were in trouble with the law. But only one of them was in jail.
To be a good basketball player or a baseball player, first of all, you got to be a good liar, a good low life, and an imbecile.
Take a lot of drugs.
You got to take steroids. You must take steroids. And anybody that takes steroids is a garbage pail.
That's John Gotti Sr. himself, sharing some family wisdom with his grandson during visiting hours. Now, was the old man joking or was he serious? I'll leave that for you to decide. But I can tell you for free and for certain that when it was time to advise his own son, when Gotti Jr., facing charges that could send him to bars for life, took permission from a judge to fly across America to meet his father for closure, I can confidently tell you that his father was dead serious.
So Joseph told me, John wants closure. I said, Joseph, that's not that word ain't on my son's vocabulary. That's overeducated, underintelligent motherfucker. That way, closure.
You see, the word closure was code for leaving the mob. Gotti Jr. wanted to leave the mafia, his father's organization, because he believed that was the only way he could get the feds and DA off his back, because he was tired of the mob life, because in his own words, he wanted to return to his home in Oyster Bay, New York, to raise his 4 children before they are grown. It wasn't an easy ask. It was never going to be an easy ask. And it wasn't just because his father was once an untouchable Don. It was because he had always loved and idolized his father.
My father was my cause. If my father wasn't in that life, I probably wouldn't have been in the street life either. Whatever he was is what I wanted to be. And if he decided the next day, you know what, I don't like this anymore, I'm gonna be a butcher, I would tell him, I hope you have a smock for me.
Gotti Jr. was born John Angelo Gotti on Valentine's Day, 1964, in the Queensboro of New York City. At the time he was born, his father was already neck-deep in the Gambino family, working under the guidance of Gambino underboss Agnello Neil Della Croce. You could say he was born with some extra fight in his blood, his father with pure Sicilian heritage, and his mother was half Italian and half Russian. Gotti Jr. also happened to get his middle name from his crazy godfather, Angelo Ruggiero, whose nickname in the mob was Quack Quack. The FBI was less humorous with their description of Gotti Jr.'s godfather. They called him an unpredictable psychopath. Now, if you were the superstitious kind, you would say Gotti Jr.'s future had already been determined, especially when you consider that their life of crime paid off. He grew up in a 2-story house that overlooked Howard Beach in New York, along with his 4 siblings, Frank, Peter, Victoria, and Angel. Now, you must know that John Gotti's wife wasn't all too pleased with her husband's career choice. She tolerated it all right, but she also made him promise he would keep their kids out of it. This was a promise he wasn't too intent on keeping, but we are getting ahead of ourselves, because being the son of John Gotti came with unavoidable consequences. And in the case of Gotti Jr., not even the innocence of childhood or the protective efforts of his mother was enough to shield him from the reality of his father's trade. When John A. Gotti was just 5, his father got a 3-year prison sentence. The prolonged absence made many of his friends at the time believe that he was fatherless. In 1972, fresh out of prison, John Gotti arrived while his son was playing out with his friends in a brown Lincoln Continental Mach 4 with smoked windows at a time when nobody had smoked windows. Armed with a chance to prove them wrong, Gotti Jr. proudly showed off his father to his friends as they watched in awe. He moved like he owned the whole block, and everyone wanted to be in his orbit. However, 3 years later, his old man was back in prison on another 2-year sentence for an attempted manslaughter charge. But you see, These prison visits were training wheels. So far, Gotti had kept his end of the bargain to his wife. His son knew nothing of the violent life he led for the Gambino family, but this suspended reality was about to come to an end. Because when he turned 16, a devastating event struck their home and forced John Gotti to reveal the monster within.
The death of Junior's younger brother Frank in a traffic accident was considered the most traumatic event in the family's history, and it would have serious consequences for the neighbor who killed him.
Gotti Jr. was 16 at the time, and his younger brother Frank was just 12. Frank had a neighbor that had a motorized bike, and that day he was giving every one of his friends a chance to try it out. Luckily for Frank, he was also a friend, and it was his turn. So on the afternoon of the 18th of May, 1980, Frank dashed to his friend's house and got on the motorbike. But before his friend could give any instructions or precautions for handling it, Frank had taken the bike on a ride.
He was riding a mini bike. Unfortunately, he jetted out into the street, coming off the Belt Parkway, and the car hit him. The car hit him and killed him.
The death of Frank broke the family. His mother was inconsolable, hooked on tranquilizers and weeping on the top floor. Meanwhile, their father showed no emotion to anyone, but when he was in his den...
But my bedroom, the vent was attached to his den, and I would hear him cry. I would hear him cry.
The death of Frank was a mistake. It was an error, and everyone knew this. But everyone knew well enough that no one took from John Gotti without him taking something back. A life for a life, eh? John Favara, the man responsible for Frank's death, went once to apologize to the family. Gotti's mom hit his head with a baseball bat. That should have been his cue to skip town with his family because he was backyard neighbors with the Gottis. But for some reason, Favara stayed another 4 months. 1 week, the Gotti family is on vacation to Florida. The next, Favara is abducted by some men at his place of work, days before he planned to leave. Till today, no one is sure how he died. His body was never found, and he was declared dead by the FBI in absentia. Some say he was beaten, hacked into pieces, and his parts thrown into a river. Others say that while Favara was alive, he was dismembered with a chainsaw, stuffed into a barrel filled with concrete and dumped in the ocean, or buried somewhere on the lot of a chop shop. Eventually, the authorities came to believe that mob hitman Charles Carniglia killed Favara and disposed of his body in acid. As Gotti Jr. grew older, he joined the New York Military Academy. And when he was done, his father helped him start a trucking business. And when that failed, he got a position in the Carpenters Union. This is what his mother wanted for him. Frank's loss was too much for her. She couldn't bear losing another child to any form of violence or accident. But the older Gotti had other plans for his son. And as much as he loved his wife, he was ready to go against her wishes to turn their son into the kind of man he was.
They were shot numerous times with automatic weapons. Questions?
Where were they hit?
They were hit in the head and in the body.
It was an unsanctioned hit, but John Gotti wanted to be king, and the man on the throne was Paul Castellano, a don with no street cred who had hesitated to get into the drug trade and was losing the family money, so he had to go. With Paul's death, the older Gotti became head of the Gambino crime family, and Gotti Jr., who had already followed in his father's footsteps up to that point, working the rackets and gambling den, became a rising star in the New York underworld. After his father had established himself on the mob throne, Gotti Jr. became an official member of the Gambino family. He became a made man. He was no longer some runner or some daddy's boy on a leash. He was now his own boss, a proud member of the mafia. And by 1988, he was made a capo, a captain, the youngest in the crime family's history. He was still in his mid-20s at the time.
When my father embraced me and put his arm around me and looked at me as a street guy, as a knock-around guy, a bounce-around guy like himself, proudest moment of my life. It was the proudest moment of my life.
Of course, this was nepotism in full display. The younger Gotti hadn't earned his stripes. His father handed them over to him. He only got it because he was the boss's son. But to make sure no one was saying that, the older Gotti ensured he wasn't present at the ceremony for his son. Meanwhile, the Gambino family grew in wealth and power under John Gotti. At its peak, it was racking in $500 million annually, and Gotti's own salary was about $10 million of that sum. At the same time, the legal troubles that came with being the man at the top were endless. But Gotti was a slippery operator, because while he had gotten the nickname Dapper Don for his good looks, charisma, $2,000 suits, and hand-painted ties, he was also incredibly tough to pin down. Try as much as it could, the law found it difficult, almost impossible to catch up with the older Gotti. And after, he became the first Don to face federal RICO charges and walk free. After becoming the only Don to beat those same RICO charges 3 times over, the media, the streets, and the people had another name for him. They called him the Teflon Don, and they loved him with a passion.
The government may consider Gotti a dangerous mobster, but to people from his neighborhood, he is a hero.
As a hostage,
You're going to, and those juries were biased.
Several hundred of them stormed the Brooklyn courthouse where
Unfortunately, the old man began making mistakes. Sammy Gravano was Gotti's underboss, and a man that the Gambino boss trusted deeply. But when Gravano warned him to be wary of gathering his men together in one place for meetings, John Gotti didn't listen. Beginning in January 1988, Gotti, against Gravano's advice, required his capos to meet with him at the Ravenite Social Club once a week. This incredibly reckless move allowed the FBI to watch them closely and get a sense of their structure and hierarchy. Eventually, and with multiple murder cases pending, the FBI arrested John Gotti along with Gravano on the 11th of December, 1990. Gotti would try to frame Gravano, and Gravano would turn on him, offering evidence to the feds and securing Gotti's conviction. Gotti was sentenced to life imprisonment in April of '92 without the possibility of parole and with a $250,000 fine. The Teflon was gone. The Don is covered in Velcro, and all the charges stuck. And this was the witty declaration of the New York director of the FBI at the time. But the bars that held Gotti were just a formality. The Dapper Don still held on to power from his prison cell, and to show he was serious about this, his son, Gotti Jr., became the acting mob boss, relaying orders on his behalf. Gotti Jr. and his younger brother Peter were allowed to visit their father in prison as family members, and through them, John Gotti ran the family business. It was a really dicey situation because left to everyone in the mob, Gotti Jr. should not have been in charge. He was too green. Even as the boss's son, everyone still saw him as a new kid on the block, a Sunday driver. But if we were going to give credit where credit was due, he at least tried to be more discreet than his father. The senior Gotti had been brought down by FBI bugs and taps in restaurants and walkways in spots they knew he'd frequent. So Gotti became incredibly secretive and unpredictable in both his dealings and movement. Mob discussions were discussed while walking and away from restaurants. He tried to pose as a legitimate businessman, and for the most part he kept the peace, but that peace was temporary to say the least. Many made men in the ranks still felt he was incompetent. In negotiations, he was criminally unskilled and undermined by other families. So it wasn't surprising when the Gambino family began losing out on deals to other families. And to amp up the frustrating situation, the Gevanese family refused to deal with him. By '95, Charles Carnelia and John Elite began to hatch a plan to kill Gotti Jr. because they believed he was too soft. Luckily for the younger Gotti, the hit was called off before it could happen. But while he was fighting battles on the business front, he was also struggling to hold on to the family in his father's absence. In fact, Gotti Jr. was falling out with his father. The older Gotti complained in tapped messages to his daughter Victoria that his son was losing a sense of his place and treating him as an equal when he was not. He was his son. The crescendo of it all came in the summer of '97. One of the biggest of the 20th century by any mob boss with Sicilian heritage. The FBI had been stalking Gotti Jr., but he'd been so tight-lipped and so cautious, they had gotten nothing but images of the young Don taking walks with his underboss while having conversation they were not privy to. But then they changed tactics and began searching properties he owned. And can you imagine how surprised they were when they found one of the most incriminating discoveries of the time in his basement of all places? The FBI found a typed list of the names of all made members of the Gambino family, along with $348,000 in cash, a list of the guests who had attended his wedding, 2 handguns, and the dollar amount of their wedding gift. If he wasn't Gotti's son, if he wasn't the acting head of the Gambino family, he would have been asleep with the fishes in the wake of that damning discovery. That list should have been destroyed, the money kept in a safe, and the handguns making rounds in the streets. So for all his caution, Gotti Jr. just gave credence to his detractors. He wasn't competent after all. As you'd expect, the older Gotti was enraged from behind bars. The New York media had a field day calling his son the dumb fella, and unfortunately for the young mob boss, his error would be vital to his eventual arrest.
To John Gotti Jr., it's father like son, a man of few words.
Can't go to work anymore, it seems.
He said you can't go to work anymore, it seems. Police say John Gotti Jr. was not on his way to work when they arrested him last night.
By 1998, Gotti Jr. found himself hooked on RICO charges. There were tons of charges that could stick, but the case that was as tight as Frank Costello's lips in a court hearing was an extortion issue with an upscale strip club in Manhattan. The indictment showed that the Gambinos, under Gotti Jr., had forced the owners of the strip club to pay $1 million over a 6-year period in order to stay in business. The mob boss himself had a cut of $100,000 from the total sum. Meanwhile, those lists came in handy, and the prosecutors were able to obtain evidence evidence that Gotti Jr. had been taking advice from his father in prison. Fact was, he was toast. And with nowhere to turn, he was bound for a long time behind bars. But you see, the love of a father is worth its weight in gold. Truth is, it is priceless. And despite the fact that Gotti Jr. had bungled his way into jail, he knew he could go meet his father for advice, for his blessings, and for closure. Now, at the time, the older Gotti was suffering from throat cancer, and it had taken out his jaw. He was so disfigured that when Gotti Jr. saw him, he wept. But this is why so many people loved the Dapper Don. He was the author of his fate, and he accepted whatever life gave him that he knew he couldn't fight off. He made fun of his pitiable state. "Yeah, I told your mother I don't even have anymore." Those were his exact words to his son. He loved his son. There was no doubt about that. But in spite of the love John Gotti had for his son, he did not want his son to give in to the prosecutors. "Don't take a plea bargain," the older Gotti advised. "They won't stop." He was basically telling him that if he gave in, the authorities would come after him till he had a permanent address in the can. But the old man could sense hesitation in his son's demeanor. It didn't help that their mother had come to know the true depth of their son's involvement in the mafia and had refused to see her husband for almost 6 years at the time. In fact, word had gotten to him that his wife swore she would leave him if he didn't let his son walk away from the mob. So, as a caveat to his advice, he told him he would understand whatever decision he chose to take.
So I know your feelings, Dad. I'm falling off a cliff. I'm falling off a cliff.
In a way, he had his father's blessing to do whatever he had to. So, faced with 4 acts of racketeering, including bribery, extortion, and threats of violence, Gotti Jr. pled guilty to all charges, accepted a plea bargain, and was sentenced to 6 years, 5 months in prison, with a $1 million fine on the 4th of September 1999. His uncle, Peter Gotti, became acting head of the Gambino family after his sentence. By the way, he was more incompetent than the young Gotti. I mean, they nicknamed old Pete the dumbest Don, but he was loyal. In June 2002, John Gotti himself passed away, and Peter Gotti became the official head of the Gambino family, away from the Dapper Don's influence. Meanwhile, Gotti Jr. began to claw himself out of the mob from behind bars, and while it's no easy feat to leave the mafia even with a Don's blessing, it's even harder to convince the authorities that you have abandoned a life of crime and are no longer a criminal after being the head of a crime family.
Everybody in the streets let me move on with my life. It's the government that didn't let me move on with my life. They says you can't. The guys in the street says, good riddance. Take care. Have a good time.
In 2004, and just 4 months before, John Gotti Jr. was about to complete his sentence when he was arraigned once again, this time for an 11-count racketeering charge that included an alleged plot to kidnap and kill a man known as Curtis Sliwa.
Will you tell your client to make sure that no one goes after Curtis Sliwa?
He's out of the mafia. The government knows it. They didn't allege a single criminal conversation from 2003 on. They were bugging him in prison. Every one of his conversations with his friends were bugged. They didn't offer a single tape to the jury. Why? Because he's done.
But who was this man, Curtis Sliwa? And what crime did Gotti Jr. commit in prison that was about to undermine his plans to walk away from the mob? Because the fact was, if he got convicted on these charges, he would end up with nothing less than 170 years in the hole. The stakes were incredibly high. But there was just one problem. This case that Gotti Jr. was facing wasn't recent. It was from as far back as 1992, when his father was still alive and before the older Gotti was even arrested. Curtis Sliwa was a well-known, outspoken freedom fighter against the mob. He started very early and stayed consistent. He was also a radio talk show host and the founder of the Guardian Angels, a non-profit organization for unarmed crime prevention. It was a deadly cocktail of engagements for a man like Sliwa, one that was sure to put him in trouble. And it eventually did. Back in April of 1992, the man boldly declared John Gotti public enemy no one, calling him a drug dealer and declaring war on the Gambino family live on his radio show. 2 months later, a Gambino family soldier named Joseph D'Angelo, and known as Little Joey, posed as the driver of a cab that Mr. Sliwa, on his way to work, hailed near an apartment where he sometimes stayed. Another man, Michael Yanati, called Mikey Y, sat up suddenly in the front seat, wearing a cap and a bandana over his face, and shot Mr. Sliwa several times. Mr. Sliwa, bleeding heavily, managed to climb past the men into the front seat and out a window. He escaped within an inch of his life, and more than 10 years after the incident, he wanted his pound of flesh. You can't blame the man, and neither can I. We weren't the ones who got shot or had to haul our bleeding bodies out of a moving cab to save our lives. But Gotti's father's advice had begun to sound like a prophecy at this point. The government wasn't looking like they had any intentions of stopping until he was permanently behind bars. 3 trials would follow that sought to indict John Gotti Jr. over the same charges. Luckily for Gotti Jr., his father's spirit might have been over him or something, the spirit of the Teflon Don, because all 3 trials over the span of 2 years ended in a mistrial with the juries not agreeing on a verdict. In 2006, the federal prosecutors decided not to pursue a 4th trial. At that moment, it looked like this was the end of it. John Gotti Jr. had somehow been able to achieve something neither Gotti Sr. nor anyone anyone in the mob could ever have dreamed of achieving. Unfortunately, the excitement was a little premature because the authorities weren't done with him just yet. In 2008, just 2 years later, he was once again arrested on charges of racketeering, conspiracy to murder, and trafficking more than 5 kilograms of cocaine. The first two alone were more than enough to send him back to the pen permanently. The racketeering charges came from a drug trafficking ring Gotti allegedly operated along with the man who had secretly planned to kill him, John Elite, back in the late 80s and early 90s. Meanwhile, the murder charges were for killings that happened in 1988, 199, and 1991. 20 years later, and that was what the authorities were charging him with. Gotti pleaded not guilty. The case moved to trial. The trial dragged on into 2009. Then it was moved to New York. Meanwhile, the man who had tried to kill him turned to a government informant. John Elite became a rat, pleaded guilty to 2 murders, 4 murder conspiracies, at least 8 shootings, and 2 attempted shootings, as well as armed home invasions and armed robberies in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Florida, stemming from his alleged involvement in a Gambino crew in Tampa, Florida. Elite first agreed to testify in the trial of another Gambino family enforcer, Charles Carneglia, the man he had plotted with to kill Gotti Jr. Charles was found guilty of 4 murders and would go on to serve a life sentence. But Elite wasn't done. He then served as a key prosecution witness against Gotti. And this is where things began to get a little messy. During the trial, when Elite accused Gotti of being responsible for at least 8 murders, the former Don allegedly threatened John Elite by mouthing the words, "I'll kill you," before engaging in a shouting match with him. You don't win the jury with that kind of behavior. And everyone was sure Gotti had bungled his case with his courtroom row, but his sister was quick to come to his defense, calling Elite a pathological liar, a rat caught in a proverbial trap, caught in his own lies. However, whatever Elite thought he'd done was undone by December of 2009. And against all odds, all 12 jurors on the case announced that they had failed to reach a unanimous verdict on all the charges brought up against Gotti Jr., and the judge declared a mistrial. After the trial, many of the jurors said that they did not find the witnesses, especially Elite, to be credible. One of the jurors reportedly called for the trial to be called off because it seemed like a sham, saying, "They should stop this now. It's ridiculous." Meanwhile, one other juror spared no words with his condemnation of the entire trial process, calling abusive and saying that it has almost become a mockery. Eventually, in January 2010, the government decided they were done with the goddess. They wouldn't pursue another case against him. He did it. He was now a free man, or was he? Back in 1990, Gotti Jr. got married and went on to have 6 children with his wife. Out of those 6, only one seems to be on a path of violence, John Gotti III. But don't worry, it's not the kind of violence the FBI would raise eyebrows at. It's the kind they would pay tickets to watch with their Quantico buddies. So what about Gotti's siblings? Well, what about them? No one knows anything about Peter Gotti, John's younger brother, and that tends to be a good thing if you've had history with the mob. His older sister Victoria is a writer and former reality TV star. She might have married Carmine Agnello against her parents' wishes, but they've long been divorced for the better part of this century because the mobster's been in jail. John's other sister Angela is a ghost, which is also a good thing, and we all know that Frank is dead, but, and I know it's tempting to keep asking this question over and over again, has Gotti really left the mob? Or better still, has the mob truly set him free? What do you think? As recently as 2015, the former Don was stabbed in the stomach in New York. According to news outlets, he was breaking up a fight when he got stabbed, but true to the code of the mob and the principles that his father taught him when he was just a kid, Gotti Jr. refused to cooperate with the cops to pin his assailant. He might no longer be a part of the mob, and I bet some mobsters hate him with a passion, but I'm pretty certain a good deal of them must have been proud when they heard the news. He did what he was asked, he kept his mouth shut, and he got closure without becoming a rat. I don't know about you, but that sounds like proper closure to me. Want to watch more videos where I uncover more mob-related events like this? Click a card on the screen and I'll see you there.